To say that the 60s were a tumultuous time in the history of our nation is probably an understatement. You had assassinations of great men. You had protests against the Vietnam War, and on college campuses, riots, spitting on our soldiers when they came home. It was a horrible time in the history of our nation, and oftentimes we see revival come in the midst of a time like that. And the Jesus movement is a movement just like that. It came in at the end of the 60s, early 70s, when our nation was still reeling over many of these things, Watergate, and the Spirit of God just began to move upon the hearts of people, young people, specifically hippies, and began to save them. And it wasn't unusual at Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa to see a barefooted, holy jean, bell-bottom jean, whatever you want to say, t-shirted guy sitting next to a guy with a suit on, with his Bible open, listening to Chuck Smith teach the Word of God. That was the Jesus movement, and Chuck Smith was a major player in that. God gave him that grace. A guy who didn't like hippies particularly. He thought they needed to take a bath and get some clean clothes on and get a job. But his wife was like, I love them, Chuck. We need to pray for them. And God began to bring them into his presence and into his church, and they got saved. Chuck Smith, who is he? He was a guy that was a Foursquare pastor, I believe, raised in the Pentecostal denomination, never really understood the whole idea of grace until God just gave him a revelation of that later on in his ministry, where it's not about his works, it's not about what he does, but it's what about God has done for him. And he began to carry that message to that generation of hippies, but not just that generation of hippies either. It was his church was filled with old people, young people, athletes and jocks, hippies and drug addicts, people coming to the Lord and getting rid of all those things. But God began to use him in that ministry of grace, like no other, I think, in his time. All right, so how did I end up in Ruidoso? Man, that is a story. I was actually in full-time ministry at the Albuquerque Rescue Mission as the assistant director there, and began to work with the homeless for 3 years. Left that feeling like a failure, and spent the next 6 or 7 years just becoming a general contractor, the thing I didn't want to do. And finally, I'm going to Calvary Chapel, Roswell, to lead worship for the worship leader there. And my pastor in Rio Rancho, at Calvary Chapel in Rio Rancho, told me that they were looking for a pastor in Ruidoso. And I was like, so what? I'd kind of given up on the dream and the hope that that's what God had called me to do. But I tucked it back away in the back of my mind, went to Roswell, led worship. God really began to speak to me and actually through me there. And on the way home, Devin and I began to just talk about the possibility of Ruidoso. And a few weeks later, there we were.
So my connection with Calvary was kind of in and out throughout the years. I was called to ministry later and served in Baptist churches, but in the last year, God has rearranged my life and connected me with John. And so John and I are kind of partnering here at Calvary Chapel Ruidoso to accomplish the will of God, the mission of God for us in this season and the church life here in Ruidoso. And it's really been an amazing run, especially in the last year or so. It's just been something that none of us could have planned. I joined up with John when the church was over on Vision Drive, and he just gave me an open door as a brother. And it's amazing that he came over to this 707 Meacham and started walking it. And he reminded me a few months back how that he had began praying around here, walking around the building. And I remember saying to him when he reminded me that I was actually jealous of the move he was going to make over here. I thought, wow, this is going to be an amazing location. And really, it's kind of an extension of the Jesus movement. And in this aspect that John and I are both, we're different in some ways, we're the same in many ways, but we're both revival pursuers. And that's where I think the connection happens, is we desire for the power of God through the Word of God, through the worship of God, of course, to be manifested in local church and spill over into the community. And that's kind of what's been happening with us in the last 8 or 9 months, is God has just been rearranging things and setting us up to be, I believe, a unique, life-giving church here in Ruidoso. As Greg Laurie would say, what our nation needs is another Jesus revolution. And so we're excited about what the future holds. We're excited for the people that God is bringing to Calvary Chapel Ruidoso. We don't really want to reach churched people per se. We want to reach unchurched people. Nothing against church people, but we want to reach people who are far from God and don't have a church home. And so it's very exciting to be a part of what's going on. You can't predict it, and so that makes us have faith. And so the future is bright, but it's unknown. So these are exciting days.